We have a lot of wastewater and drinking water infrastructure needs in Idaho. We pulled data from a lot of different sources that basically encapsulates every system in the state that was asking for money to help them with infrastructure upgrades. So every request, we sort of aggregated that all together. And we think that right now there's about $1 billion in wastewater and drinking water infrastructure needs in the state.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. Tune in to explore the research that puts University of Idaho in the top 4% of U.S. universities in terms of research. As Idaho's only Carnegie R1 institution, we're leading the way in innovation and discovery. My name is Lee Cooper, and I am a science writer and editor here at University of Idaho, and I am joined by my co-host, Danae.
Hi, Lee. I am Danae Lenz. I'm the External Communications Coordinator at U of I.
And we're back, Danae. We're back from our summer hiatus, where you should definitely go and catch a quick summer series that Danae put together. But now we are actually entering a very special season of the podcast, as is the start of the 10th full season of the Vandal Theory.
So this is super exciting, and I know you've been here the entire time. You've been keeping this podcasting ship afloat for the past 10 seasons, which is pretty bonkers.
It has been super fun. All of the interviews I've done have been just so unique and so different, and I'm always just thrilled to learn about what our professors and faculty are doing. And if anyone else wants to go check out those old seasons, they're all on, any of your favorite podcasting platforms. Go and check them out anytime. And we're now going to get a chance to kick off a really amazing 10th season.
I'm excited.
All right. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about Idaho's water, where we get it, and where it goes once we're done with it.
All right. I'm excited to get into it.
So a question to kick us off. How much have you thought about where your water comes from?
Frankly, I don't think about it all too much. I think about it sometimes because the tap water where I live has a funny taste to it.
As does Moscow's.
Yeah. And people like to comment on it, and I have started filtering my water. Not because I'm afraid of it, but because it makes it taste better. Beyond that, sometimes, yes, I think about why does my water taste a little bit funny? But beyond that, I have not put hardly any thought into it. I know it comes from an aquifer. I couldn't tell you which aquifer. So, yeah, long story short, I have not thought about it.
I realized as I wrote that question that I had no idea where Moscow's water came from, which I have looked up since then and found that we have two aquifers that we pull from, the Grand Ronde and the Wanapum. But I did not know that at the start of doing this podcast. Today we're going to be joined by Liz Bageant, an economist with the James A. and Louise McClure Center for Public Policy Research. Liz is going to discuss how Idaho's growing population, its aging infrastructure, and regulations affect the future of drinking and wastewater in the gem state and the jobs that industry supports. Ready to go?
Let's dive in.
Liz, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and thanks so much for having me.
Excellent. Well, before we jump into your work, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? What's your background?
Sure. So I am the economist at the University of Idaho's McClure Center for Public Policy Research. And the research that I do at the McClure Center is nonpartisan and intended to really tie as directly as possible to issues facing the state of Idaho. So we work hard to figure out what's immediately relevant to decision makers in Idaho and how can we get them the information that they need.
Well, that sets up my first question for you. What questions are you broadly studying? What are the needs of our state?
We were approached by the Department of Environmental Quality here in Idaho and the Association of Idaho Cities to see what we could learn about wastewater and drinking water systems in the state of Idaho. We wanted to understand where things really stand with Idaho's infrastructure, like the physical parts, as well as the workforce and some other related elements.
Okay. What are some of the aspects of your study that you knew you were going to have to look at?
Well, we suspected that there were some infrastructure needs in the state because there are infrastructure needs across the country right now in the wastewater and drinking water space. And then Idaho has really been growing quickly. So the intersection of growth and these infrastructure needs is really on the minds of people who are trying to figure out how to get us clean water and keep our environment unpolluted by wastewater.
What makes it so important to look at kind of the population growth and explosion that Idaho is having with our water needs?
People who are putting together a wastewater treatment plant or a drinking water system and thinking about what the group of people that they need to serve, they look into the future and they think, how many people do we have now? How many people are we going to have in 10 years, in 20 years? Let's make sure we have that capacity. But the growth in Idaho has really been a bit unexpected. Like Idaho was planning on growing, but maybe not quite as much as we actually have in the last 20 years, but especially in the last 5 to 10 years. So the intersection of these two things, like we have all these people and they need these services. And so how are systems managing to adapt to meet those needs that come with population growth?
So I know they teach entire classes on the next question that I'm going to ask, but we could try and keep it pretty simple. I'm guessing a lot of people don't think about where their drinking water comes from and where their wastewater goes unless maybe they're literally passing a plant on the highway. What does it take to get clean water to our kitchens and then to make sure that our wastewater enters back into the ecosystem in a environmentally friendly way?
Yeah. So you're totally right. Infrastructure in general is often taken for granted. We just sort of use it. We don't think very hard about it until it stops working. So when it comes to drinking water in Idaho tends to come from wells, but it can also come from surface water like rivers or reservoirs. But most of Idaho gets their drinking water from sort of underground. And that water comes out of the ground and goes to a centralized location for like a city or a town and gets treated in accordance with federal rules about what can and can't be in drinking water to make it safe. Once the water meets those standards, it's conveyed to homes and businesses. There's a lot of infrastructure in the treatment part, and then there's a lot of infrastructure in the conveyance. So pipes and pumps underground sort of spreading out in a network across some geographical area. That's what the drinking water system looks like in like very broad terms.
Okay.
On the wastewater side, it's sort of like the reverse. So we use water, we get it dirty, and then it has to go somewhere. So it goes through a different set of pipes and pumps through a network to bring it to a centralized location where it's treated. And like drinking water, there are rules about the quality of the water. So what level of quality does the water need to be before it can go back into the environment? And that involves removing solids and contaminants of different kinds. And then what happens to that water sort of varies. Sometimes it's released into a water body after it's clean. Sometimes it's sprayed through sprinklers and reused to like water grass or grow crops. There's also some sludge associated with it, and that usually goes to a landfill or in some cases is applied to like a field or some sort of space.
Okay.
So that's the general process on both sides. But I actually wanted to add one thing. There's sort of a bunch of physical processes, but there's also a lot of people who are doing this work. These systems are run by cities, but they're also run by homeowners associations. They're run by water districts, sewer districts. Every once in a while, a county is involved in running one of these systems. And then there are people, plumbers and operators and technicians and billing clerks who are actually making all of this happen behind the scenes. So there's sort of a human infrastructure as well.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, these are relatively complex systems that take a decent amount of know-how how to run. I mean, let alone all of the administrative needs that go along with any sort of factory type setting.
Yeah, really a lot goes into it all. And I think we're so used to having clean water and watching things go down the drain and not thinking about them after that point. So,
all right. So let's get into basically what you found. And I know that there's a couple different points that we want to stop along on the different things that affect this. So let's start with when we're talking about what makes the current Idaho water systems challenging. Let's start with population. We've alluded to the fact that we're growing and that we're growing at a slightly higher rate than anybody really was forecasting. So can you talk to me about that? What's population challenges are there out there?
I think everyone in Idaho knows that we're experiencing a lot of growth. People outside of Idaho may not be aware of that. We are one of the fastest growing states in the US right now. And since about 2000, we've grown by 54%. So we were at maybe like 1.3 million around that time. We've added 700,000 people since then. Wow. So we're right at 2 million over the last 25 years. And that's a lot of people to provide all kinds of services to. It's not just wastewater and drinking water that has experienced a lot of sort of like a shock from this population growth. But all of these people use water and they generate wastewater, and we need to do something with that. The growth was anticipated to a degree, but not to the degree that it actually happened.
Is the pressure equal across the state?
That's a great question. The answer is probably not. We have a really hard time in our data looking at exactly what locations in the state have the greatest needs at any given point in time, and I will spare you the details of why that's difficult. But we do know that looking at population growth, it has not been even across the state. The northern part of Idaho, so Kootenai County, Bonner and Boundary counties, the sort of Boise metro area, and then around Idaho Falls has seen the most growth, though everywhere in the state, every county in the state has grown in the last 10 years. You would see like more larger populations in those concentrated areas associated with some of the cities.
Is there any other data from what you were looking at in terms of population that has a really big impact on the water story?
So I think alongside population growth is housing growth. So as we build more, each structure that you build literally must link to these systems unless they're using a well or septic, which is another thing that happens in the state, and that was sort of outside the scope of our study. So if you have a house with one person living in it, you still have to put the same amount of infrastructure as if you had 17 people living in that house, right? So every structure that we build requires some sort of infrastructure to manage water and wastewater. And in Idaho, we've seen growth in housing construction as well. It maybe hasn't quite kept up with the population growth, but it tracks the same trend and applies pressure to these systems.
What's one of the other big points that you are finding is affecting Idaho's water infrastructure now?
Yeah, so there are two other things that are really putting pressure on these systems. One is sort of very predictable, and that is that these systems get old and they wear out and you need to replace them. And that's like true of everything. You know, your car, a pair of scissors, like whatever thing you have, like it's not going to last forever. And that is true for these systems as well. So a lot of the water-related infrastructure in the U.S. is sort of nearing the end of its lifespan, and that's true in Idaho as well. So that's not an Idaho-specific problem, but it's very much happening here. And then the other thing that's always going on in the background that puts pressure on these systems relates to regulations. Since the 70s, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act are these federal laws that drive the rules around keeping water clean or cleaning out wastewater. And the Clean Water Act is really about like reducing pollutants into the environment through wastewater, and the Safe Drinking Water Act is about managing contaminants so that we sort of protect our public health. The definition of what is polluted and what is a contaminant has really changed over time. So scientists are always sort of studying like what's bad for the environment, what's good for the environment, what's bad for health, what's good for health. And all these things that might have a negative effect sort of get tossed into a bin of things that could be potentially regulated through the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. Over the years, new things have become regulated that weren't regulated in the past. And every time a rule comes out that you need to get your arsenic levels lower in your drinking water, that can lead to a infrastructure need because the systems might not be set up to meet that regulation. And so we've seen in the last couple of years some new pretty stringent drinking water regulations related to lead and things like PFAS, which are the chemicals that are really widely found in like nonstick pans and cleaning products and beauty products and carpet. They're really everywhere. So all of these regulations just sort of march forward, and system managers are required by law to meet them, and they have to figure out how to make the infrastructure do that. And oftentimes that costs a lot of money.
Okay. What was the general take-home message? What's your message to the legislators and the Department of Environmental quality. Is that right?
Yeah.
What's the message to them?
The message to them is that we have a lot of wastewater and drinking water infrastructure needs in Idaho. We pulled data from a lot of different sources that basically encapsulates every system in the state that was asking for money to help them with infrastructure upgrades. So every request, we sort of aggregated that all together. And we think that right now there's about $1 billion in wastewater and drinking water infrastructure needs in the state. This is probably an underestimate because there are some systems who maybe don't have the administrative capacity to fill out a loan application form, but they know they need this work, and we wouldn't have seen that in our data. So it's probably higher than that. $1 billion is a big number, and about 2/3 of that is wastewater, which that infrastructure tends to be a little more expensive, and 1/3 is drinking water, though a lot of the newer regulations that came out last year are related to drinking water. So over the next several years, we're expecting drinking water needs to go up in order to respond to some of those.
Would that $1 billion get us to being good like right now in 2025? Or does that also look ahead to we're not going to stop growing anytime soon, as from what I understand? Does that get us at all into being okay in the future?
That's a great question. I would say that drinking water and wastewater system managers are trying to anticipate how to meet those needs over, say, the next 30 years. This is in part because forward thinking is always a great idea, and in part because the way that these systems are financed when you upgrade them is through like 30-year loans or bonds. So they need the system to last that long. They don't want to be paying off a system that's already obsolete. So they're thinking on sort of a longer time horizon, but it's really hard to know what's going to happen in the future. And so in terms of population, some of the funding sources that come through the federal government don't allow systems to consider population growth when they are asking for money, which is an interesting little piece of a rule that has pretty big impacts in a place like Idaho. So there's some sort of inherent bureaucratic challenges in figuring out how to finance a project if you're really worried about population growth. But it's easier to finance a project if you're worried about meeting regulations. So there's some strategy that these different managers are employing when they look for financing for upgrades. But it's really hard. So last year, about $220 million in financing support was available to systems in Idaho. So if the needs are $1 billion and we have $220 million, that is not enough. And this year, the federal funding landscape has really shifted. So it's pretty unclear what's going to be available. And the legislature allocated $10 million this year. So that's about 1% of the need in the state. We see quite a few shortfalls.
So for Idaho, what does that mean? How do you get financing for something like this?
So that's a great question because it's somewhat complicated and somewhat maybe misunderstood. So the main mechanism for financing a large infrastructure upgrade is through a loan. And these loans often come through the State Revolving Fund, which is a program of the Department of Environmental Quality. And that program is largely supported by federal funds. And so when the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act were passed, these funds were created to help support systems in staying up to date with regulations. So Idaho has a fund, and systems can apply for loans from that fund. These are loans, so they're not necessarily grants. So to pay back those loans, people in town who are receiving drinking water and their wastewater is being disposed of, they're paying a monthly fee for that service. And part of that monthly fee is going back to pay those loans back. And so what is happening in a lot of places in Idaho, especially small places, is that maybe there's a very large infrastructure need and you could get a loan for it. But in order to pay back that loan on the 30-year whatever time frame, you have to increase the user's costs, like their monthly fee, so much that it's unaffordable for people. And so managers are really caught in a tough spot when it comes to these loans because they don't want to put financial pressure on their sort of citizens. And this is particularly challenging with small systems because they have fewer users to sort of spread those costs across. And in Idaho, like I think it's 97% of drinking water systems are small. More than half of wastewater systems are small. So these small systems are really facing a lot of financing challenges. There have been some grants and some loan forgiveness programs that have eased some of that pressure, but the financing is not, even though a lot of it is coming through federal dollars, it's not, they're still paying for it. Everyone is paying for it sort of in town. I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding. And as we think about what's happening in the federal funding landscape, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether that opportunity for these low-cost loans is even going to be available going forward.
No, that's interesting. What I'm actually paying for when I pay my water bill.
Yeah.
That's probably where a lot of it's going towards, not, or at least not solely, the literal running of the plant.
Yeah, and like the gold standard is that you can find the sweet spot where the amount you charge your users covers your operations and maintenance and sort of ongoing costs, and you're socking away a little bit of money for a future need, and you're paying off the system that you have now, and it all works out. But in practice, finding that sweet spot can be very difficult, especially for small systems.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, being that Idaho does have quite a rural population.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're getting on towards the end here. So any last points you want to leave with our listeners?
Sure. So one of the things that stood out to me that I didn't really expect when I was doing this research was the types of jobs that are associated with these systems are maybe not perceived as glamorous, running a sewage treatment plant, running a drinking water system. But in my conversations with people across the state and looking at some of the data related to these jobs, I was pretty impressed by the caliber of them on certain dimensions. So I wanted to share a little bit about that because it's maybe not what the high school guidance counselor is advising people to go into, but I found some interesting data points. So the first point is that they pay pretty well. So the median wage of a drinking water and wastewater system operator in Idaho is $53,000 a year. That's well above the median wage of the state across all occupations. So it's a decent job in terms of pay, and there's really a lot of demand for the types of workers that support these systems. So that could be like a licensed operator or a technician, but also tradespeople like plumbers and pipe fitters, maintenance people who can run heavy equipment. Those jobs are in high demand across the state. So workers really have a lot of power, and they have opportunities there because of that demand. And these jobs are everywhere. So even the smallest places, if there are people there, there's a wastewater system, a drinking water system, and work to be done. You can take your skills and go to wherever you would like to be, whether it's in Idaho or not, in a rural area, in an urban area. And that's not necessarily the case with a lot of kinds of jobs. And then my last thing that I learned is that job satisfaction is like quite high in these areas. And this is largely because people running these systems know that they're doing something really essential for their community. So, you could be the town clerk or the city clerk, but that's not for everyone. That sort of public service, you might have that in your mind as something you'd like to do to serve your community, but like maybe you don't want to be responsible for all the bureaucracy, but you know how to run a backhoe, or you know how to do chemistry and water testing. So these operators are really playing an essential role in like a hands-on way in their community. And I have a little story to tell you about this because I met so many people who were just doing really inspiring, like community-oriented work, and nobody knows about it because nobody's thinking about where their water is coming from or where their wastewater is going. So I met someone who runs a water treatment plant in a very small place, and this treatment plant also provides water for fire hydrants in their town. So in the middle of the night, when the town fire siren goes off, the volunteer firefighters, they rush to the scene, and this guy also jumps out of bed and goes down to the treatment plant to make sure that it's running at full capacity so there's enough water for the firefighters to fight the fire. And then, he goes back home and goes to bed when everything's all settled.
Oh my gosh.
So in a sense, he's like a first responder, but nobody in town, except maybe people he lives with, knows that he's getting up in the middle of the night when there's an emergency to make sure that the resources are there. So this is the kind of thing that's happening behind the scenes with these systems that I found inspiring and exciting, and hope that other people will too.
Well, that's amazing. Well, Liz, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure, it was my pleasure.
All right, Danae, so what'd you think?
I thought that it was super interesting, and now I am definitely going to be thinking more about where my water comes from and all of the crazy things that go into getting it to and from my house. But the thing I was thinking of throughout the interview is just all of these things, challenges that arise when you've got a population that's growing as fast as Idaho's is. And we've talked about a few others on this podcast, housing and all sorts of things. But yeah, just there's so many challenges out there. It's great that our population's growing, but there are just all these things that come up that you wouldn't otherwise think of. And there's so many different aspects and so much infrastructure that needs to be upgraded, and yeah, just all these things to keep people safe and happy.
I think the thing that it reminded me of as we were talking about just, where your drinking water comes from and what it takes to keep it clean and the challenges to keeping it clean. And what I was thinking of was the fear that I've experienced just a handful of times that I've actually been on boil water orders because of storms or whatever the case may be. And just having that kind of, your feet pulled out from under you type thing of, the system that you think is going to work and you have trust that it's going to work, and then it not working, and just it ingrains on how important and reliant we are on these systems was one of the things I was thinking about. And then just as a side note, I was also really interested to know what goes into my water bill. Mm-hmm. I found that particularly personally interesting. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to the Vandal Theory. You can visit our website, uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory, to learn all about our research. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu with any questions. And please take the time to visit us on any of the podcasting platforms you enjoy, where you can rate and review and absolutely subscribe. My name is Lee Cooper.
And I'm Danae Lenz.
Thanks for listening.